Hello everybody and welcome back for another topic. Today I want to discuss something that is incredibly misunderstood, the idea that the sale of Treasury securities constitutes borrowing, which it is not, and I'm going to go over that. I hold in my hand here, right here, this is the daily Treasury statement. You can get this right off of the Treasury's website if you go to www.fms.treasury.gov. FMS is the Financial Management Service of the Treasury, and this comes out every single day. It's an exact, detailed, itemized list of every single expenditure of the Treasury for that particular day and all the receipts that it takes in. It's really very fascinating when you go over this list because it brings to light very clearly and very obviously that the Treasury is spending money every single day, and sometimes it spends more than it takes in. For example, some of the expenditures on here, you have defense payments, you have the education department, you have federal salaries, you have the federal highway administration, housing, and all the administrations, the labor department, you have Medicaid and Medicare, you have NASA programs, you have the Postal Service. Also included on here, on this sheet, is exactly the sale of the Treasury securities for that day. In this particular case, this was for today. This was for yesterday, which was Tuesday, May 26th. You had the sale of, right here, 479 million. It was a light day in Treasury securities for that day. It also shows how much was redeemed in terms of. So all this is, it's a daily ledger, which shows exactly how much the Treasury has spent on all the various itemized things on this list and how much the money it has taken in. And for this particular day, actually, when you look at this, it's very interesting because the Treasury took in 7.5 billion, but it sent out or paid out 17.2 billion. So you had about a $10 billion deficit there. Now, that goes to show you that every single day the Treasury is spending money. And we know by definition that any expenditure of the Treasury results in an increase in reserves to depository institutions, banks, for example. Those reserves are merely electronic credits that are put there. That's how the Treasury spends. And that is the money that is used to buy the securities when they're ultimately sold. So you have to think of the sequence here. Treasury spends first, which results in a credit to the banking system, and those reserves are eventually swapped for an interest-bearing account, which is known as a Treasury security. Once you get the understanding here, you really start to see that the sale of Treasury securities constitutes nothing more than the management of reserves in the banking system. It's done simply to sustain an interest rate. There is no borrowing per se because the money is spent first, the credits are put into the banking system, and those reserves are simply exchanged for an interest-bearing account of the U.S. government known as a Treasury security. So we can actually say then that the money to buy Treasury securities, and for that matter to pay taxes, but I'll get into that in another discussion, the money to buy Treasury securities comes from government spending itself. The money is put there first by the government when it spends, and those reserves are simply then swapped for an interest-bearing account that we call a Treasury security. There is no borrowing per se. This is not a loan. These are credits in the banking system that ultimately get exchanged for an interest account from the U.S. government in the form of a Treasury security. And this doesn't only go for our banking system. It goes for the world. And when you hear people say, oh, you know, the Chinese, they're financing us, it is not true. It is the same dynamic that is going on. Absolutely the same dynamic. Spending by government results in an increase in reserves in the banking system globally. And those reserves are eventually exchanged for an interest-bearing account of the U.S. government known as a Treasury security. So, a very simple way to understand this is simply that the money to buy treasuries comes from government spending itself. And for that matter, the money to pay taxes comes from government spending itself. But as I said, I'll get into that in another discussion. All I wanted you to understand here now is that the sale of securities really is only functioning to manage a level of reserves in the banking system to maintain an interest rate. The Treasury can stop selling securities tomorrow, and it would absolutely have no effect on its ability to spend. Why? Because as I said many times here, the government spends in its own currency, and any country that spends in its own currency where that currency is not backed either by gold or some commodity, or where it is not convertible into another currency and where it floats freely, there is no constraint on how much it can spend. The only constraint is political, and we run into that very often, unfortunately, because that keeps us from maximizing our potential here in this country. But there is no real borrowing per se. So it's a very fascinating topic, and it's something that is so incredibly misunderstood. But it is, I'll tell you this, it is in the Manual of Operations for the Federal Reserve. If you go to my blog at mikenormaneconomics.org, I actually have the actual sentence that came from the Fed's manual, which explains that spending by the Treasury results in an increase in reserves to depository institutions. Those reserves eventually, when the Treasury quote-unquote sells securities, that's simply an interest-bearing account that is offered by the U.S. government in exchange for reserves which earn no interest. Well, now they earn interest, but up until recently, they didn't earn any interest. And that's it. Very simple to understand. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. See you next time. Bye.